The night started off innocently enough, with pizza, video games, and the usual banter that my best friend Ethan and I shared during our sleepovers. We had been best friends since elementary school, and our sleepovers were a cherished tradition. This time it was at Ethan's place, a cozy, two-story house on the outskirts of town. It was a typical summer night, warm and filled with the sounds of crickets and distant laughter from neighbors' houses. We stayed up late, watching horror movies and challenging each other in the latest video games. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. Ethan's parents were out of town for the weekend, so it was just the two of us. We set up our sleeping bags in his room, talking about everything and nothing until we finally drifted off to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night, a chill running down my spine. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The room was dark, the only light coming from the pale moonlight filtering through the curtains. I turned over in my sleeping bag, trying to get comfortable again when I noticed that Ethan's bed was empty. "Ethan?" I whispered, sitting up and rubbing my eyes. There was no response. A sense of unease settled over me as I looked around the room. Then I saw him, standing by the window, his back to me. He was perfectly still, staring out into the night. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the summer air. "Ethan, are you okay?" I asked, louder this time. He didn't respond or move. His silhouette was eerily motionless, and something about his posture made my skin crawl. I got up and walked over to him, my footsteps quiet on the carpet. As I got closer, I noticed his eyes were open, but they seemed vacant, as if he wasn't really seeing anything. "Hey man, are you sleepwalking?" I asked, gently touching his shoulder. He turned slowly to face me, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "It's calling me," he whispered, his voice a hollow monotone that sent shivers down my spine. What's calling you?" I asked, my heart pounding. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to the window, staring out into the darkness. I followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual, just the empty street and the trees swaying in the breeze. The moonlight cast long, eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Ethan, snap out of it," I said, shaking him lightly. "You're freaking me out." He blinked slowly, as if coming out of a trance. I don't know," he said, his voice trembling. "I was dreaming, I think, but it felt so real." "Let's just go back to bed," I suggested, trying to sound reassuring. "It's probably just the movies we watched messing with your head." He nodded, and we both went back to our sleeping bags. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the night. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off. I was jolted awake again sometime later, the room feeling unnaturally cold. I turned over and saw Ethan standing by the window again, staring out with that same vacant expression. This time, he was whispering something under his breath. "Ethan, come on, this isn't funny," I said, getting up once more. My heart raced as I approached him. "You need to wake up." He turned to me, his eyes wide and fearful. "It won't stop," he whispered. "It's calling me. It wants me to come." I felt a surge of panic. "What are you talking about? Who's calling you?" Before he could answer, he started walking towards the door, his movements stiff and mechanical. I grabbed his arm, trying to stop him. "Ethan, you're sleepwalking. You need to wake up." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a terror that made my blood run cold. "I can't stop it," he said. "I have to go." He pulled away from me with surprising strength and headed downstairs. I followed him, my mind racing. He walked through the dark house, straight to the front door, and opened it. The night air was cool and filled with the sounds of the forest that bordered his backyard. "Ethan, where are you going?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. He didn't answer. He stepped outside and began walking towards the woods. I ran after him, my heart pounding in my chest. The trees loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, their branches swaying in the wind. "Ethan, stop!" I shouted, but he kept walking, his gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. I grabbed his arm again, trying to pull him back. "You're not yourself. You need to wake up." He turned to me, and for a moment his eyes seemed to clear. "Help me," he whispered. "Don't let it take me." "Take you? What are you talking about?" I asked, but before he could answer, his expression went blank again. He pulled free from my grip and continued into the woods. I followed him, the darkness closing in around us. The further we went, the colder it became, and the sounds of the night grew distant and muffled. It felt like we were entering another world, one that existed just beyond the veil of reality. "Ethan, please stop," I begged, but he kept walking, his movements slow and deliberate. We reached a clearing, and Ethan stopped in the center, staring up at the sky. The moonlight illuminated his face, and I saw tears streaming down his cheeks. "It's here," he said, his voice a broken whisper. "I can't fight it." I looked around, trying to see what he was talking about, but there was nothing there. Just the trees and the shadows and the cold, oppressive silence. Then I heard it, a soft, low hum that seemed to come from all around us. "Ethan, we need to go back," I said, grabbing his hand. "This isn't right. We need to leave." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "It's too late," he said. "It's already here." The hum grew louder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The shadows seemed to shift and move, taking on shapes that defied logic. I pulled on Ethan's hand, trying to drag him back towards the house, but he wouldn't budge. "Ethan, please," I pleaded, my voice breaking. "Come back with me." He shook his head, tears falling freely now. "I can't," he said. "I'm sorry." Before I could react, he let go of my hand and stepped into the center of the clearing. The hum grew louder, and the shadows closed in around him, enveloping him in darkness. I reached out, but it was like an invisible barrier kept me from getting any closer. "Ethan," I screamed, but he was already gone, swallowed by the night. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The hum faded, and the clearing was silent once more. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the spot where Ethan had vanished. Eventually, I turned and ran back to the house, my heart heavy with grief and fear. I called the police, but they found no trace of Ethan. He was gone, disappeared without a trace. The official story was that he had run away, but I knew the truth. Something had taken him that night, something from beyond our understanding. I never told anyone what really happened. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw, and I know that Ethan is out there somewhere, trapped in the darkness. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the hum again. A haunting reminder of the friend I lost and the terror that still lingers in the shadows. It was a typical Friday night when my friends and I decided to have a sleepover at Mark's house. We had all grown up together, our bond forged in the shared experiences of childhood. Mark's basement had always been our hangout spot, a place where we could escape from the watchful eyes of parents and be ourselves. That night, as we gathered our sleeping bags and snacks, there was an air of excitement. It had been a while since we had all been together like this, and the basement had a certain nostalgic charm. The old couches, the flickering TV, the worn-out rug, all of it felt like home. We settled in, the dim light of the basement creating a cozy atmosphere. Mark's parents were out of town for the weekend, so we had the house to ourselves. We played video games, watched horror movies, and laughed until our sides hurt. It was perfect, or so we thought. Around midnight, the power went out. The sudden darkness was jarring, plunging the basement into an oppressive blackness. The only light came from the glow of our phones, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Great," Mark muttered, fumbling for a flashlight. "Probably the storm." We hadn't even noticed the storm brewing outside, the wind howling and rain pounding against the windows. Mark found the flashlight and clicked it on, the beam slicing through the darkness. "Let's make it more interesting," Jack said with a grin. "How about some ghost stories?" We all agreed, huddling together on the old couches, the flashlight casting long, dancing shadows. Jack started with a story about a haunted forest, his voice low and dramatic. Sarah followed with a tale about a ghostly hitchhiker. When it was my turn, I hesitated. I had always been sensitive to the supernatural, and something about the basement felt off that night. But I didn't want to seem like a coward, so I began my story about the old asylum on the outskirts of town. As I spoke, I noticed a change in the atmosphere. The basement seemed colder, the shadows darker. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to me like a second skin. Just as I was finishing my story, we heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the far corner of the basement. We fell silent, listening intently. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. "What is that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Probably just the pipes," Mark said, though he didn't sound convinced. The tapping continued, echoing through the basement. It seemed to be coming from behind the old wooden door that led to the storage room. We rarely went in there. It was filled with boxes of old junk and had always given us the creeps. "Let's check it out," Jack said, his bravado masking his nervousness. We followed him to the door, the flashlight beam flickering slightly. Mark reached for the handle, but the door was locked. "That's weird," he said. "It's never been locked before." Just then, the tapping stopped, replaced by a soft, whispering sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent chills down my spine. We all looked at each other, fear evident in our eyes. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Yeah," Jack replied. "Let's get out of here." We turned to leave, but the door to the basement slammed shut with a deafening bang. We were plunged into darkness, the flashlight flickering and finally going out. "Someone get the light!" Mark shouted, panic creeping into his voice. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight app. The beam was weak, but it was better than nothing. We huddled together, the whispering growing louder, more distinct. "Help me," it said, the voice low and mournful. "Please, help me." "Who's there?" Sarah called out, her voice shaking. There was no response, only the continued whispering. We moved towards the basement door, trying to get out, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it shut. "We need to get out of here," Jack said, his voice filled with urgency. We tried the windows, but they were stuck fast. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. "Help me," it repeated, a sense of desperation in the voice. "Let's try the storage room," Mark suggested. "There's a window in there." We turned back to the old wooden door. The tapping had started again, more frantic this time. I held the phone's flashlight steady as Mark fumbled with the lock. To our surprise, the door creaked open. The storage room was filled with old boxes and furniture, covered in a thick layer of dust. The air was musty, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. We searched for the window, but it was boarded up. "What now?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with panic. Before anyone could answer, the whispering turned into a low, guttural moan. The air grew colder, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned, and there she was, a figure, shrouded in darkness, her eyes glowing with an eerie light. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice sending a chill down my spine. We backed away, the figure moving closer. The moaning grew louder, more agonized. I felt a cold hand brush against my arm, and I screamed. "Get out!" Mark shouted, pulling us towards the door. We stumbled out of the storage room, the door slamming shut behind us. The whispering continued, now coming from all around us. We ran to the basement stairs, pounding on the door, shouting for help. The door finally burst open, and we scrambled up the stairs, not stopping until we were outside, gasping for breath. The storm had passed, the air cool and fresh. We huddled together, our hearts racing, the memory of the basement's horrors etched into our minds. We never spoke of that night again. Mark's parents moved shortly after, selling the house to a new family. We went our separate ways, but the experience left a scar on each of us. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispering again. It's faint, almost drowned out by the sounds of the night, but it's there. "Help me," it says, a haunting reminder of the terror we faced in that basement. And I know, deep down, that whatever was in that basement is still there, waiting for someone to help. But I also know that I will never go back. Some things are better left forgotten, buried in the darkness where they belong. I still remember that night vividly, the night that changed everything. It was supposed to be a fun sleepover at my best friend Ethan's house. We had planned it for weeks, gathering snacks, movies, and games to fill the night with laughter and memories. But the night took a turn none of us could have anticipated, one that haunts me to this day. Ethan's house was old, one of those grand Victorian homes that looked both majestic and eerie, depending on the lighting. That night, under the silver glow of the full moon, it looked particularly foreboding. But we were excited, and our minds were far from ghost stories or haunted houses as we set up our sleeping bags in the spacious living room. Ethan's parents had gone out for the evening, leaving us with the house to ourselves. We spent the first few hours playing video games, stuffing our faces with pizza, and watching cheesy horror movies. As midnight approached, the excitement of the day began to wear off. and we settled into our sleeping bags, the room dimly lit by the flickering light of the TV. We were drifting off to sleep when we heard it, a soft, rhythmic thumping coming from above. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but Ethan's wide eyes told me he had heard it too. We exchanged uneasy glances, the thumping continuing, steady and persistent. "Is there something in the attic?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Ethan shrugged, looking genuinely puzzled. "I don't know, my parents never go up there. It's mostly just old furniture and junk." The thumping grew louder, more insistent, as if something or someone was trying to get our attention. We sat up, our hearts pounding in our chests. The house, which had felt warm and welcoming earlier, now seemed cold and menacing. "We should check it out," Ethan said, his voice trembling slightly, "just to make sure it's nothing." Reluctantly, I agreed. We grabbed our flashlights and crept up the stairs, the old wood creaking under our weight. The thumping grew louder as we reached the second floor, the door to the attic looming at the end of the hallway like a dark, gaping maw. With a shaky hand, Ethan reached for the doorknob. The door opened with a long, drawn-out creak, revealing a narrow staircase leading up into the darkness. The thumping was almost deafening now, echoing down the stairs and reverberating through the house. We climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling like a leap into the unknown. When we reached the top, we found ourselves in a large, dusty attic, filled with old furniture covered in white sheets. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, and our flashlights barely pierced the darkness. The thumping had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. We moved cautiously through the attic, our flashlights illuminating the ghostly shapes of forgotten furniture and boxes. I could feel my pulse in my throat, the fear almost tangible. Then we heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. We froze, our flashlights swinging towards the source of the noise. In the far corner of the attic, partially obscured by shadows, was an old wardrobe. The shuffling continued, coming from inside the wardrobe. We exchanged terrified glances, but neither of us dared to move. The door of the wardrobe creaked open slowly, revealing a dark, empty interior. The shuffling stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Then, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a child, a young girl, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide and empty. She was dressed in an old-fashioned nightgown, her hair tangled and matted. She stared at us with a look of indescribable sorrow, her eyes reflecting a depth of despair that chilled me to the bone. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, help me." We were rooted to the spot, unable to speak or move. The girl took a step closer, her eyes pleading. "They locked me in here," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been here for so long." Ethan found his voice first. "Who locked you in here?" he asked, his voice shaking. "My parents," she replied. "They thought I was different. They didn't want anyone to know. Please, you have to help me." Something about her story didn't add up, but the fear and desperation in her eyes were real. We couldn't just leave her there. Ethan moved closer to her, his hand outstretched. Before he could reach her, the attic door slammed shut with a force that shook the house. We spun around, our flashlights casting frantic beams of light across the room. The temperature dropped suddenly, our breath visible in the cold air. The girl's expression changed, her sorrowful eyes turning cold and menacing. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice now a chilling hiss. "You can't leave." Panic surged through me, and I grabbed Ethan's arm. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. We ran to the attic door, but it was locked tight. The girl's laughter echoed around us, a haunting, mocking sound that filled the attic. "You can't leave," she repeated, her voice echoing in my mind. Desperation set in, and we pounded on the door, shouting for help. But our cries were met with only silence and that eerie laughter. I turned to face the girl, but she was gone, vanished into the shadows. "Ethan, we need to find another way out," I said, trying to keep the panic from overwhelming me. We searched the attic frantically, looking for any possible escape. But the windows were boarded up, and the only door was the one that had slammed shut. The shadows seemed to move around us, the air growing colder and heavier. Then we heard the thumping again, this time coming from beneath us, as if something was trying to break through the floor. The boards began to creak and groan, and we backed away, our flashlights flickering. Without warning, the floor gave way, and we fell through, landing hard in a small, dark room below the attic. The air was damp and musty, and the only light came from our flickering flashlights. We were in a cellar, a hidden room beneath the house. The thumping continued, now louder and more frantic. I shone my flashlight around the room, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw them. Skeletons, dozens of them, huddled together in the corners, their bony fingers clawing at the walls. Ethan let out a strangled cry, and we backed away, our eyes wide with terror. The thumping grew louder, coming from all around us. The skeletons seemed to move, their hollow eyes turning towards us, their jaws opening in silent screams. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." We scrambled to our feet, searching for an exit. In the far corner of the cellar, we found a narrow staircase leading up. We ran up the stairs, our flashlights barely illuminating the way, the thumping growing louder with each step. When we reached the top, we found ourselves back in the basement, the door to the outside standing open. We didn't hesitate. We ran out of the house, the cold night air hitting us like a slap to the face. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of the streetlights. We never spoke of that night again. Ethan's parents returned the next day, unaware of what had happened. The house stood silent and dark, its secrets hidden within its walls, but the memory of that night haunts me still. The girl, the skeletons, the thumping. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the thumping again, echoing in my mind. And I know that the house is still there, waiting, its dark secrets ready to claim another soul. And I know that I will never be able to forget, never be able to escape the terror of that night. It all started as a thrilling adventure, something to mark the end of our high school years and the beginning of whatever lay ahead. It was supposed to be one last hurrah before we all scattered to different colleges and jobs. Jack, Sarah, Kevin, and I had grown up together, our friendships solidified over countless sleepovers, late-night talks, and shared secrets. The idea of spending a night in the old abandoned house on the edge of town seemed like the perfect way to seal our bond. The house had been vacant for as long as any of us could remember. It was a grand old Victorian, once beautiful, but now decayed and overgrown with ivy. The stories about it were legendary, whispers of ghostly apparitions, strange noises, and the family who had vanished without a trace decades ago. Of course, we didn't believe in any of that. We were teenagers, armed with flashlights, sleeping bags, and enough snacks to last us the night. We met at the edge of the woods just after sunset, the sky ablaze with the dying light of day. Jack was the ringleader, as always, his grin wide and infectious. "Ready for a night we'll never forget?" he asked, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Definitely," Kevin replied, his voice steady but his eyes betraying a hint of nervousness. Sarah and I exchanged a glance, both of us feeling the same mixture of fear and anticipation. The path to the house was overgrown, branches grabbing at our clothes as we made our way through the dense underbrush. As we approached the clearing where the house stood, the atmosphere grew heavier, the air thick with an unnameable tension. The house loomed before us, its windows dark and empty, its once white paint peeling away in long, curling strips. "Here we are," Jack said, pushing open the rusted gate that led to the front yard. Home sweet home. We followed him up the creaking steps to the front door, which hung slightly ajar. The hinges groaned in protest as Jack pushed it open, and we stepped inside. The air was cool and musty, filled with the scent of dust and decay. Our footsteps echoed off the high ceilings and empty rooms as we made our way to the parlor, where we decided to set up camp. The parlor was the least damaged room in the house, with a large fireplace dominating one wall and a few pieces of broken furniture scattered about. We laid out our sleeping bags in a circle, placing our flashlights and snacks in the center. "This is going to be awesome," Jack said, settling into his sleeping bag. "Just think of the stories we'll have to tell." We spent the first few hours talking and laughing, our voices filling the empty space and pushing back the darkness. As the night wore on, the conversation turned to ghost stories, each tale more gruesome and terrifying than the last. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the windows. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply and an eerie silence settled over the house. We huddled closer together, the flickering beams of our flashlights casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. We fell silent, listening. At first there was nothing, just the wind and the creaking of the old house. Then faintly we heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on a table. "It's probably just the wind," Kevin said, though his voice lacked conviction. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. It seemed to be coming from upstairs. Jack grabbed his flashlight and stood up. "Let's go check it out," he said, his bravado wavering. We followed him up the grand staircase, the steps groaning under our weight. The tapping grew louder, echoing through the empty halls. As we reached the top of the stairs, we saw that the hallway was dark, the air even colder than before. The sound led us to a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. Jack pushed it open and we stepped inside. The room was empty, save for an old, dusty rocking chair in the corner. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. "I guess it was nothing," Jack said, his voice uncertain. We turned to leave, but as we reached the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed the handle, pulling with all my might, but it wouldn't budge. "Let us out!" Sarah screamed, pounding on the door. Then we heard it, a low, guttural whisper, like the voice of someone who hadn't spoken in years. "You shouldn't be here." We turned to see a figure standing in the shadows, its form barely visible in the dim light. It was a woman, her face gaunt and hollow, her eyes dark and empty. She took a step closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "Leave this place," she whispered, her voice rising in a chilling crescendo. We backed away, our fear mounting. The woman's eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold dread wash over me. She raised a hand, pointing to the door, and I felt an unseen force pushing me toward it. Suddenly, the door flew open, and we stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. We didn't stop to question what had happened. We ran down the stairs and out of the house, not stopping until we were back in the safety of the woods. We never spoke of that night again. The house stood silent and dark, its secrets hidden within its decaying walls. But the memory of the woman haunted me, her hollow eyes and chilling voice echoing in my mind. Months passed, and we all went our separate ways. But the experience left a mark on me, a lingering sense of unease. One night as I lay in bed, I heard a faint tapping on my window. My heart raced as I got up to look, but there was nothing there. Just the wind, I told myself. Then the tapping came again, louder this time. I froze, fear gripping me. Slowly I turned and saw her, standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes locked onto mine. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, her voice filling the room. I screamed, but no sound came out. The room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to close in around me. I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, and the last thing I saw was her face, twisted into a grotesque smile. The next morning, they found me in my bed, my eyes wide with terror, my heart stopped. The doctors couldn't explain it, but I knew the truth. The house had claimed me, just as it had claimed the Thorne family all those years ago. And now it waits for its next visitors, ready to share its dark secrets with those who dare to enter.